Friday, the 6th of March, 2026. And the big question that's bouncing around the world, it's on the tip of everyone's tongue, is why do we find suddenly that the West is in conflict with Iran? Why did America and Israel suddenly decide they needed to attack and launch an unprovoked war against Iran? Well, as always, good old Donnie came to the rescue with his clear, concise rhetoric yet again. And he gave us four, in his very first briefing, he gave 4 reasons why we needed to attack Iran. Not just one, but 4. And I'll read them to you. Reason number one, why we needed this, to confront this imminent threat from Iran. We needed to destroy Iran's missile capabilities. Quite ironic, don't you think, coming from a nation with the world's 2nd largest stockpile of nuclear-armed missiles on Earth. However, it apparently has been decided that Iran is not allowed to have missiles, which is strange considering it has never initially fired one at any nation. It has fired in response to attacks, but it has never initiated a strike with any of its missiles, so we can say they're purely defensive. However, they're not allowed to have them anymore. That's been decided. Number 2, Donnie said, annihilating Iran's navy. Note the use of the wording here. Not constraining, not reducing, not monitoring, but annihilating Iran's navy. Iran, as a state, as a sovereign nation with a large coastline, is no longer allowed to have a navy. Once again, says a country with the world's most powerful navy. Interesting. Number 3, now this is the one that grabbed all the headlines. This is the big one that got people talking. Preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons. Now, just the week before, Tulsi Gabbard, Donald Trump's head of intelligence, she came out and she said that the entire resources of the US intelligence community could find no evidence, 0 evidence, that Iran was developing nuclear weapons. Not surprising, considering only last year Donald Trump said that he had bombed Iran's nuclear weapons production facilities and completely destroyed Iran's ability to make nuclear weapons. And yet here we are, just a year later, starting a war to stop them from getting nuclear weapons. So it mustn't have been that successful, the last year one. Also, the head of the IAEA, say that 4 times quickly, the International Atomic Energy Agency, Grossi, that's the United Nations body responsible for monitoring nuclear compliance around the world. He came out and he said they could find no evidence at all that Iran was building nuclear weapons. Added to that, you have the fact that Iran's leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, had issued a fatwa, a religious edict, in a country where the head of the nation is the religious leader. So what he says goes. And he said no. He said Iran will not pursue the development of weapons of mass destruction because they are incompatible with their views on Islam. Whereupon we murdered him. So in order to prevent item number 3 on Donnie's list, Iran getting nuclear weapons, we killed the one person who was stopping Iran getting nuclear weapons to make sure Iran didn't get nuclear weapons. I'll let you, Donnie, you can explain that better than I ever could, I'm sure. And number 4, now this is the one that I think is the kicker to me. And it is this, I'll read it to you. Ensuring the regime can't continue to fund, arm, or direct terrorist armies outside of its borders. You mean like in the way that Barack Obama dropped weapons and money to terrorist armies in Syria and Iraq and fueled the rise of ISIS and al-Nusra Front and basically installed the leader of one of those butcherous, barbarous regimes as the head of the state of Syria. Once again, pot, kettle, black, you make up your mind. Anyway, will the real reason that the war against Iran has started please stand up, take center stage? Dun, 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 dun. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, that's what we're going to talk about. I'm Bintang Bernie. This is Friday News Review. So, welcome to the program, and you may be wondering about the title of this week's program, Iran's Dreadnought, because Iran obviously doesn't have a dreadnought. But what I want to talk to you about are some of the parallels of history, because history is full of parallels. And if you recall, last year I did a program talking about the concerns I had with the rampant militarization which was taking place and is still taking place in Europe today, and the parallel with the military build-up and the naval arms race that preceded World War I, and the tensions between Britain and Germany and the massive investiture of military equipment, the amount of money and expenditure that went into the armed forces. And I drew the parallel with what's happening in Europe today, where we've got this wonderful situation of European nations actually taking money, denuding their health and their welfare budgets, taking money out of hospitals and schools to increase their military expenditure, and this rampant paranoia and this rampant militarization which is happening in Europe, and the parallels between the two, and how Europe is now moving towards defense budgets which are rating at 5% of GDP. Just so you know, 5% of GDP was the United Kingdom's defense budget during the Cold War. So just to put this into perspective, these are the kinds of military levels of expenditure that Europe is making on a perceived Russian threat. The same Russian army they say is incompetent because it can't beat Ukraine, but yet is somehow going to sweep across Europe if they don't put all this money into armaments and tanks and so forth. But anyway, that's what I was discussing, the parallels with what happened before the First World War and today. Now, ironically, HMS Dreadnought rears her ugly head yet again, because I want to talk about something which, bear with me, I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson, but it's very relevant to what is going on in the world today in regards of military equipment. Back in 1905, the Royal Navy laid down HMS Dreadnought, the first all-big gun battleship, and she gave her name to a dynasty. She was the start of a dynasty. Every battleship that came after was referred to as a dreadnought or a super dreadnought. And the ships that had built before her were rendered obsolete due to the technological advances in Dreadnought and the fact that she was the first all-big gun battleship. Now, prior to this, the United Kingdom had maintained what they called the two-power standard. That was, the Royal Navy was consciously and deliberately kept at a level where it equaled the strength of the next two largest naval powers. So to put it in simplistic terms, if naval power number one was the United Kingdom, if naval power number two had 12 battleships and naval power number three had 8 battleships, well then the United Kingdom would maintain a minimum of 20 battleships so that it had parity with the next two largest fleets in the world. And that gave the United Kingdom basically an unassailable position, and that's why you hear all these songs, Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Their fleet was enormous relative to the rest of the world, and no one could catch up because they had that big an advantage in the number of vessels they had in commission. Now, in 1905, the British had a huge dilemma because the all-big gun ship was coming. And there's talk about Cuniberti was designing it, the Americans were looking into it. But the British realised one thing very early on, and they were very much aware of the technological need to build an all-big gun battleship. But the Achilles heel of their system was that in doing so, they would, at a stroke, make all of the existing battleships, this huge battle fleet that they'd built up, they'd make it obsolete overnight. And in fact, thereafter, the Germans referred to their pre-Dreadnought ships as the ships built before HMS Dreadnought came to be known. The Germans called them 5-Minuten-Schiffe, 5-minute battleships, because they felt that they would only last 5 minutes against a Dreadnought ship. So great was the disparity in firepower. And so the United Kingdom had this huge issue in that in building HMS Dreadnought, it secured the technological lead on the way ahead, but at a stroke, it went from having a navy which was as large as the next two largest navies combined to having a navy that led the world by one ship. And therein was the dilemma, because now other navies at last had a chance to catch up, because the Royal Navy, even though it was the first to build a Dreadnought, was now only one ship ahead. So other navies could start building Dreadnoughts, and the Royal Navy's huge lead, huge disparity in numbers, was wiped out literally overnight. And so began the naval arms race. All of a sudden, everyone was on a relatively equal footing. Now, you may be wondering, okay, Bintang, what's this got to do with the war in Iran? And it has everything to do with it. During the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, but during the 60s, the Americans started with the Paveway laser-guided bomb, a technological marvel for its time, using a laser designator on an aircraft to basically put a kit onto a standard dumb bomb that just falls out of the sky, and the bomb would guide to where the laser pointed, and you had all of a sudden pinpoint accuracy. And if you recall, during the 1990 war in Iraq, another illegal American adventure, once again foisted on them by Benjamin Netanyahu. We'll come back to him in a minute. But you'll recall the Americans with great pride were showing the world videos of, missiles going through windows, and I don't know if you remember the comment, they were laughing, like mocking, this is the luckiest man in Iraq, he's driving across a bridge and it's blowing up behind him. The poor person would have been absolutely fucking terrified, but we're all laughing, it's comedy. But what you had a situation where only the major technologically advanced superpowers had the ability to conduct these pinpoint strikes, because you needed a large air force to maintain air superiority, because the range of these weapons wasn't particularly long. You had to fly planes fairly close to your target. They had to have other planes flying on a steady course, designating the target with a laser beam, or as later planes like the Tornado, etc. did, that you had a receipt weapons operator who would designate the target for you. However, you had to stay near the target, had some disadvantages, but it was incredibly expensive. You needed a big air force and lots of money. So once again, America, if you like, had this huge technological advantage. Some other countries had it as well, but very few countries were able to wage the kind of air campaign that, say, in America or at that stage the Soviet Union could, where you would have mass air power conducting these precision strikes. Time went on, and the other issue you had was that you had cruise missiles, which could be fired from submarines. Once again, only the larger, more powerful countries could afford such weapons platforms and these highly expensive weapons. Cruise missiles are very expensive to make. So once again, you had this dominance, this technological lead, this power projection that these countries had. But enter the new HMS Dreadnought, the drone, and that's why I've called it Iran's Dreadnought, because once again, with a technological leap forward, overnight, a massive disparity in force, power, and ability to project that power was wiped out overnight with the drone. Now, I don't know how many of you watch other podcasts, but I was watching last year, about a year and a half ago, I was watching Colonel Douglas McGregor. He was on the Deep Dive podcast with Daniel Davies. Now, both of these men were tank commanders, lieutenant colonels in the United States Army. They understood mechanized warfare, what we in the West call all-arms warfare, and they practiced it. They were involved in Desert Storm. And I remember Doug McGregor talking about the war in Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine, and saying that the Russians would wipe out the American army in a couple of days, that the American army was so far behind them it wasn't funny. This was only a year or two ago. And it kind of surprised me. And granted, I always thought that Doug McGregor would have a lot more military knowledge than me, but I was surprised by his statement. But at the time, what he said was, warfare has evolved. He said, what's happening in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, and the reason the advancements are so small is that drones are now the dominating weapon on the battlefield. The drones are the masters of the battlefield. And he said America didn't understand that. America was so far behind that they were still fighting these all-armed warfare. I mean, thanks to Peter Dumpton in Australia, we're still buying tanks. Good, give someone something to shoot at, apparently. And the proof of the pudding was when the Ukrainians started their much vaunted summer offensive. You may recall this. I think this was the third army that the Russians had defeated. Every time the Russians defeat the Ukrainian army, NATO goes and builds them another one. And they launched this massive all-arms assault on Russian defensive positions. And the Russians had built 5 defensive layers. The Ukrainians didn't even manage to penetrate the first one. And if you remember, Ukrainians being interviewed came back and they were angry, saying, the war that NATO is teaching us to fight is getting us all killed. You don't fight wars like that anymore. But we didn't understand that. People like Doug McGregor were smart enough to pick up and see what was going on. And what we've had happen in the Gulf just recently, just in the last 2 weeks, is a clear example of what these people were talking about. The Americans and the Israelis, and we'll talk about the reasons why in a minute, we know the bottom line. Let's just cut to the chase. Benjamin Netanyahu has been itching to bomb Iran for 40 odd years. His paranoid fixation with the Shia crescent that surrounds Israel. It's ironic. The Israelis keep saying there's all these Arabs around us. No, the Arabs aren't around you. You went and you stole a piece of land right in the middle of them. That's like jumping on an island and going, my God, this is not fair. The sea is surrounding me. So Netanyahu has been itching to do this. It's been his life's long ambition. He pushed America into previous Gulf wars. He destroyed Libya. He destroyed Iraq. And I'm starting to believe there's credible evidence that he either knew of or was heavily involved in the attack on the Twin Towers. And from that we have, the issue of the dancing Israelis, some of whom were Mossad agents, who a woman happened to notice the day before the Twin Towers attack, they were standing taking pictures of the World Trade Center. And then the day of the attack, they were standing there dancing and laughing, cajoling, as though a successful operation had happened. Anyway, that's another story for another episode. But ultimately, what happened was Netanyahu finally found a president who was dumb enough and vain enough to be talked into helping the Israelis attack Iran. He tried it with Biden. He tried it with other presidents. They were smart enough to back off and go, no, we don't really want to go down that track. He went, as we know, he was in Mar-a-Lago the week before this conflict began. I'm not going to call it a war because they haven't declared war, by the way. Why don't we call it, I don't know, a special military operation? How about that? The Americans don't like that term. They say it's not fair, it's bullshit. But yeah, it's pretty much what they're doing, isn't it? Maybe they'll learn from someone else. Anyway, Netanyahu finally was able to cajole Donny and the American government, which is infested at the moment with Zionists. The American Senate is full of Zionists. It's funded by Zionists. Zionism and Israel control America. Make no mistakes. This is the tail wagging the dog, not the other way around. Israel is running the show. And Rubio as much came out and said that when he said, he blurted out that, well, Israel were going to attack Iran and we knew Iran would fire back, so we had to go in and help them. Yes, sir, whatever you say, Mr. Netanyahu. That man is a pathological monster. He is, in my honest opinion, Benjamin Netanyahu is the most evil man to walk the planet since Adolf Hitler. He is a pathological murderer. He's dangerous. And he is the reason behind most of the wars that have started in the last 50 years. And if that man disappears, the world will be a safer place, depending, as Donny said, you never know who you're going to get to replace someone. Anyway, what happened was Iran cajoled America into this joint operation, and the Americans, once again, with their arrogance, thought that they would basically destroy Iran. They'd murder its leader, with whom they were in the middle of peace talks with, which is Scott Ritter rightly points out repeatedly. It's perfidy. It's a war crime. Legally it's a war crime to basically have peace negotiations with someone and then attack them in the middle of those negotiations. But regardless, that's nothing new for America. So what they thought was that they would kowtow Iran with their air power, their massive military advantage. And what they didn't count on was the fact that HMS Dreadnought had reared her ugly head again, because in an era of drone warfare, all of a sudden, you don't need a huge air force. You don't need aerial dominance. You don't need paveway missiles and B-52s. All you need are cheap, easy to produce drones. And these drones can be made for anywhere between $30,000 to $300,000. In military terms, let's be honest, fuck all. Okay, compared to what's an F-16 fighter is about $70 million. So these things are cheap, they're easy to mass produce. The technology is relatively straightforward. I mean, anyone who's watching this in another country now is using satellites to listen to me. Anyone who uses a phone to ring, not just overseas, down the road. It's all satellite technology. That's all drones do. They use uplink. In fact, I was watching a really interesting discussion with Ted Postol, who is an expert in weapons and knows far more about them than I do. And he was talking about the Iridium network. Iridium is a satellite and communication system which spans the entire globe. From memory, 66 satellites they have around the globe in high Earth orbit. And you can get, see, this is the thing that really makes it like the start of a new arms race, the start of the Dreadnought, where the level playing field. You can get the uplink equipment easily. It's commercially available. You don't even need to know how to make it. You can just buy it off the shelf, install it into a drone, and the drone will get real-time satellite updating as it's flying, imagery on its target. You can retarget it, and for a relatively modest, for a dirt cheap investment, you can destroy high-value targets. And we've seen this with Iranian drones knocking out US over-the-horizon radar installations valued at over $1 billion. Think of that, $1 billion installation smacked out by a $250,000 drone. So this is why I'm saying this is the parallel with HMS Dreadnought and the current technology. The advent of the drone has leveled the playing field. Now every country can have a Dreadnought because every country can have drones and every country can hurt you with those drones. And as we've seen, the great, I won't say lie, but the great misnomer that we've always been taught, about air defense and how ineffective air defense is against these drones. They're hard to track on radar. They seem relatively difficult to shoot down because they come en masse. And there is, of course, the great financial imbalance, which has been talked about, where Iran can financially drain the West. Every drone Iran fires costs $230,000, let's say, roughly. I don't know the exact cost, but chicken feed in the scheme of things. Now, Patriot missiles cost millions of dollars each. They're very expensive pieces of equipment. Every time a Patriot missile is fired, and like a lot of air defense missiles, they're fired in batteries of 2. That's pretty standard, to be honest. If you notice, that's why ships used to always have a twin-arm launcher to fire 2 missiles at a target, just to ensure success. If one missile misses, the other one hits. So they're fired in multiple strikes against these drones. Costs a fortune. And they take a long time to produce. The US Army, or the US military, receives about 550 Patriot missiles a year. Iran can manufacture that in as little as a week. 550 drones. In fact, they could probably manufacture 550 drones in a day. I believe the Russians are capable of churning out over 1,000 in a day. So the sheer numerical disparity, let alone the sheer financial disparity in this war, is becoming ever more apparent. And what the Iranians have done is very clever. They've fired a whole lot of cheap drones and relatively unsophisticated missiles at Israel and targets in the Middle East, and they've used up massive amounts, huge stock of resources, massive amounts of the inventory of air defense missiles that the United States, Israel, and these other various countries have at massive expenditure, mind you. And Iran still hasn't released the most sophisticated, most powerful of its missiles yet. So basically they're going to denude the area of air defenses, and then they can just drop in anything they like. And as I was saying before, this misnomer we've had about air defenses, and it's very interesting. If you come back to real strategic issues, you'll remember that America withdrew from what was called the ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And people never got this, and I think now people, the little light bulb will start to come on. The argument was very simple. We've always had the system of nuclear annihilation. In other words, what they call MAD, mutually assured destruction. America launches its nuclear missiles at Russia. Russia's continually monitoring. Then they fire their missiles before the American missiles hit. They cross over and boom, both countries are annihilated. So the logic is, why would America attack Russia if it knows in doing so it will get annihilated? Likewise, why would Russia attack America knowing that the response would annihilate them? It kept them both safe. And there is a bizarre, if really twisted, weird logic to it, but it seems to have worked. No nuclear-armed country has fired a nuclear missile on another country, and only one has ever used them. Good old United States, of course. But nuclear weapons have largely kept nuclear-armed countries from large-scale wars like we've had in the past, a la Second World War. The Reagan administration during the 80s, you recall, started the Star Wars program where they wanted to start building this nuclear missile defense. And at the time, the Russians were very clear, or the Soviets as it was then, I apologize. But they said, no, if you build a system where our missiles can't get through, then that makes everything by nature incredibly unstable, because we're then worried that you could fire at us at any time, annihilate us if you so choose. And remember, Reagan was the guy that called, the Soviet Union the evil empire. What if they wipe them out? There's nothing the Russians can do. It created a strategic imbalance. So the anti-ballistic missile treaty was designed to limit the amount of anti-ballistic missiles. In other words, to say to both sides, let's drop our guard, let's keep our guard down. So if you punch me, I'll punch you back, okay? If I punch you, you'll punch me back, okay? No one side has the advantage. And just so you know, the ABM Treaty allowed each side to protect its capital city with anti-ballistic missiles, interceptor missiles. So the Russians protected Moscow, the Americans protected Washington. Yes, it's all about our people. No, it's all about us. And that was that. And for years, you had idiots, the Lindsey Graham, I hate to bring that moron's name up, but who were saying we should have missile defense, and then Trump talked about missile defense. And the bottom line, as we can see now, is apart from it being a regionally or strategically, a globally unstabilizing event, having anti-ballistic missiles, it doesn't work. And we can see that today. The most sophisticated systems in the world are being defeated. Now look at the American THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System. This is an incredibly expensive piece of equipment. So incredibly expensive. Someone may correct me in the numbers if I'm wrong here, but my understanding is there's only 13 of them ever been made. 13, 1-3, from a country with $1 trillion defense budget. These things are incredibly expensive to build, and I believe each missile costs in the region of $12 to $13 million. Now, 2 of them, or actually 3 of them, I believe, have been taken out by Iranian drones. This multi-billion-dollar state-of-the-art system, and something that looks like you'd bought it in Dick Smith Electronics, yeah, boom, gone. So that shows you, and of course the massive damage that's been done to the multiple American radar installations in the Gulf, that shows you that the whole concept of missile defense is basically flawed. It doesn't appear to hold any water. And when you add into the equation what the Russians started with, and the Iranians started with too, I mean, you have to remember, Iran is an advanced, scientifically highly capable country. This isn't some bunch of sheep herders walking around the desert, right? And it's not Saudi Arabia with a bunch of lazy, overindulged rulers importing all their labor and their technology. Iran is a very self-sustained society with a long history. Christ, it's Persia, for fuck's sake. And they have a lot of good technology, and they developed their own hypersonic missiles. And no doubt there may have been some information technology sharing between Russia, China, and so forth, but why not? All countries share technology all the time. Australia does it with America, and so forth. What's the big deal? So with the advent of the hypersonic missile, you had the problem in that these missiles come down sometimes as high as like Mach 20. These things are moving at phenomenal speeds. They're going so fast that the radars and the computerization of the air defense system can't keep up with them, because by the time the radar gives the information of the incoming missile's location to the computer, and it computes a firing solution. Because remember, these things are highly complicated. You've got to fire them at things. You can't just fire Patriot missiles up there. They've got to be targeted. By the time that targeting is done, a missile moving at this incredible hypersonic speed is so far away from the original targeting location that the system has to try and retarget. And hence it just keeps retargeting and retargeting, and it doesn't actually achieve a firing solution. So until there's another major technological breakthrough in terms of radar, and we're kind of constrained there because radar has to go out and back. There are physical limitations to how radar works. So until those issues are overcome, we really have no defense against hypersonic missiles. And this has been proven time again in Ukraine, where the Russians have fired them with impunity. The Ukrainians, by the way, claim. Now, Ukraine, like Israel, is a hotbed of lies and deceit. Almost everything that comes out of that prick Zelensky's mouth is a lie. They claim that their Patriot missile batteries have achieved a 5 to 6% interception rate on hypersonic missiles. Now, even if that's true, and I don't believe one thing that comes out of Ukraine for a minute, because they've proven to lie again and again, that's the latest and greatest, the PAC-3 missile, which they've given the Patriot PAC-3 to Ukraine to defend against Russia. And the best they can claim, the best, is 5 to 6% interception. What does that tell you? That tells you that 95% are getting through, even if those figures are accurate. Let's say they are. 95% get through, beating our latest and greatest American technological super, interception missile. And if you talk to anyone who's served in the US military, this is no surprise. The Patriot doesn't really have a very successful, very high interception rate. What the problem happens in Western countries, the one advantage that countries like China and Russia and North Korea have over us is their defense contracts are given to state companies. And the state companies are just there producing stuff for the government. In the West, we have the Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex, which benefits from selling weapons. And in order to sell weapons, they are not adverse to, shall we say, cooking the books on how successful they are and promoting their weapons and how great they are and telling you they'll intercept. But of course, as you can see, the proof is in the pudding. The Middle East is not doing too well so now. So we talked about Netanyahu, his dream, his ambition to overthrow not just Iran, but as he called it, the Shia Crescent around him. He's got the Americans to do his bidding once again. This time, I think it's going to be an issue. Now, we talked about one of the reasons that this war started was regime change, and that we wanted to change the regime in Iran. Why that's our business, I've yet to work out. Oh, that's right. Apparently, Khomeini was a ruthless, evil dictator. Kept getting told about all these atrocities, and I keep saying, well, name one. Yes, they put down what was a externally motivated, controlled, and regime change coup attempt last year, where you had protesters attacking. We know Mike Pompeo, basically the head of the CIA, said the message to the people of Iran: we're with you on the streets. The Mossad put out on its Farsi channel, we're with you, we're beside you. We know that CIA and Mossad agents were in Iran fomenting revolution. Well, that's not an uprising, that's a coup. How did these people, all of a sudden, thousands of Starlink terminals just appeared in Iran? The average person in the street suddenly had a Starlink terminal and an assault rifle. Now, I went recently to a protest in Sydney, Australia, with the Palestine Action Group, protesting the arrival of Mr. Herzog and the disgusting fact that our government invited a war criminal and someone who condoned and explicitly facilitated genocide. But that's another story. But the point I'm making is, we didn't throw Molotov cocktails, we didn't have guns, we didn't have Starlink terminals. In fact, we got beaten up by the police. I didn't see anyone talk about that being repressive. or the need to change our government. Now, I'm sure there's been some bad incidents in Iran that I know of. The woman who refused to wear a hijab, just try doing that in Saudi Arabia, by the way. Try doing that in United Arab Emirates, It wasn't that long ago, women couldn't drive a car in Saudi Arabia, okay? But they could go to university. And Iran has more than 50% of its university entrants, I think it's about 60% at the moment, are women. And they specialize in scientific fields. So this repressive regime, which has all these women going to university and becoming scientists, yes, there was the incident where the woman was beaten, the woman who refused to wear the hijab, whose name, sorry, escapes me at the moment. But we have Aborigines dying in custody in Australia. No one is proposing that we have a regime change in Australia. So we have to keep these things in perspective. But people talk about the regime change operation. And and you know what? I think it might be successful. I think we might see regime change. Possibly in Bahrain, very possibly in Israel, and more than likely in the United States. So I think the regime change operation is going to come to pass after all. So maybe the boys weren't that far off target. Watch what's happening in Bahrain, by the way. The Saudis once again have put their army in there to try and stabilize it. You need to understand the Gulf states, the monarchies. They're not evil dictators. They're hereditary institutions run by families that pass down the leadership from father to son. Oh, you mean like Kim Jong-un in North Korea? Yes, exactly like that. Only he's a dictator. These guys are monarchists. The Gulf states are on shaky ground because basically these states are just run by families who have essentially usurped power and clung onto it. They rule with an iron fist. You want to talk about repressive regimes? Well, I think you would find that Iran would be the least oppressive of the Gulf states. And what's happening now is I think people are starting to question all these years of having American bases. And remember, Iran has been very careful to say, we're not targeting Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, etc., et al. We're targeting the American bases in there because you're allowing their planes or their missiles to fire into our country. So I think by just targeting the bases, the Iranians are being incredibly restrained. I think that would give them justification to wipe these Gulf states off the map if they so choose. But Iran is not like America. So the Iranians are targeting the American bases, and the people in these countries must be wondering, well, we had these Americans come in, basically take over large swathes of our country, but on the understanding that they protect us. You're safe. The Yanks are here. We're going to look after you. But instead, all that they've done is they've made these countries a target. And I wonder if my own inept American kowtowing government is actually the penny's starting to drop, no pun intended. We have, our government, we have that, Anthony Albanese, the man who championed Palestinian rights until he became Prime Minister. Richard Marles, the Minister of Self-Importance, walking around thinking he actually matters to Americans because they meet with him, and the only reason they're talking to Richard is you're throwing lots of money at them to build their submarines. And of course we have Penny Israel-is-Never-Wong, the Minister for Thoughts and Frowns. And we have American bases all over Australia. We've tied ourselves to America. I wonder if we're starting to look and go, maybe being close to these guys is not such a good idea, because not only do they invite trouble, but they can't really stop you. They're like that guy you go to the pub with. He gets a bit drunk and he mouths off and he starts a bit of aggro in the pub, but he can't fight for shit. And he ends up getting you clobbered by some bloke he starts a fight with. I had a friend like that. I distanced myself from him very quickly. I think Australia should look at doing the same. So we need to think about, are the Gulf states really any better off with America being there, or are they not? And I think the answer is no, they're not. Now, where is all this going? To finish up, I've rambled on for a while here. A couple of things we need to look at. And if you recall, I did a program last year and I talked about the Samson option, which people are now starting to talk about, which is the danger, and I said this last year, the danger if Israel gets defeated is they're probably more dangerous getting defeated than they are winning. And by that, what I meant is Israel has made it clear that if push comes to shove, they're prepared to use nuclear weapons. They are the only nation which has a nuclear arms policy which is not based on first strike. In other words, Russia, America, all of the nuclear powers, certainly the big five, all have a nuclear doctrine which says nuclear weapons will only be used if nuclear weapons are used against us. And the state looks like it's going to get overrun. Russia updated its recently because thanks to America's intervention in Ukraine and NATO's meddling, we've made that a little bit of a less safe environment. However, stick to Israel. The danger is they're getting beat and they are getting smacked right now. Yes, Iran's copping a lot of damage, but Iran is playing the long game, as we all know now. Anyone with any brains knows Iran is just going to keep firing and firing. And they've said, basically, boys, enough. You've fucked with us long enough. We've copped it on the chin. This time you've gone too far, and now you're going to pay the price. They're going to hit Israel, and they're going to hit Israel hard. They already are. The danger is, at what point does that lunatic Netanyahu, someone who should be he should be in a padded cell, not running a country, what point does he decide to use nuclear weapons against Iran? And then we've talked about, or people have talked about the fact that Iran could build nuclear weapons as if it wants. You know, the great discussion around, imbecile Witkoff talking about Iran saying they could have 10 nuclear bombs. Well, what they were saying was, we've got the capacity to build these things. We haven't built them. So maybe you want to start treating us with a little bit more respect, a little bit more, insight to the fact that we're not warmongering lunatics like you. But the danger, I see it, is the actor that no one's really talked about too much, and that's Pakistan. Now, as much as China and Russia clearly don't want Iran to fall, their fellow BRICS nation, and a linchpin of trade between the two nations, they're talking about building a railway from China through Iran right up into Russia, which would be a vital strategic transport corridor. The danger is that if Pakistan is not going to be too keen about having a pro-US, pro-Israeli regime on its border. So at some stage, the Pakistanis might start to get a little bit more involved, and they are a nuclear armed power too. So what I'm getting at here is the potential for this to escalate to possibly even limited nuclear strikes. Remember, if Iran gets nuked, all of the oil, all of the resources that are there, you'll never be able to use them. Can you imagine the impact that's going to have on the world's economy? Now, from the moment this started looking like it was happening, I was telling my wife, the Strait of Hormuz, we now know what happens, okay? And all these idiots in Australia who think, oh, it's great, end the tyranny, they'll be scratching their head when petrol's at $5 a litre. The last I heard, we're about to hit the $100 a barrel mark. Petrol, or oil, I should say, is going to go through the roof. Bahrain has already shut down its natural gas processing. They're one of the world's biggest suppliers of natural gas. Of course, Australia could step in and take over the market because we're about the number 3 largest natural gas producer in the world. But of course, we've handed it all over to Santos and private companies who will be selling it overseas at a fortune, charging us the same inflated rates. So unfortunately, an opportunity for us to cash in on this market is gone. The Russians must be rubbing their hands together, because after a decade and more of sanctions, of trying to destroy their economy by curtailing their oil production and stating that you can only buy oil at reduced prices from Russia, we've then gone and inflated the market for them. So Russian oil is now worth a fortune. So there's a huge windfall coming for Russia. Not their fault, but good luck to them, I say. Just like playing the pokies and bing, bing, bing. It's, your numbers come up flat. Well done. We've got concerns about what to do now. And you see the Americans, Trump's underwriting the insurers, because of course what happened is the insurers, as usual, were the ones who stopped the ships transiting through Strait of Hormuz. It wasn't Iran. Iran has targeted them. But before that, the insurers went, it's going to cost us money. Because the one thing insurers like to do is take money there. They insure you for things they never want to pay you for. So world shipping came to a halt. Now, we talk a lot about the 1/5 of the world's oil that comes out of the Strait of Hormuz. I think what's important to think about as well is the 80% of the Gulf states' food that flows in through the Strait of Hormuz. Have a think about it. The Gulf states are basically deserts. They don't grow anything. They don't have any food production capacity, or very limited. They import 80% of their food, and they're running out of food rapidly. So that's going to put pressure on the Gulf states to put pressure on America. So who knows where this is going to lead? So you've got all these competing geopolitical issues, the need for the world economy to get oil out, and as I said, if you watch my first episode way back in January, episode 1 of 26, I talked about the American attack on Venezuela. And at that stage, I said to you, the Americans are positioning themselves for a war with Iran, because what they went and did was they grabbed the world's largest oil supply. They did a deal with Dulce, the number 2, who turns out like she's a bit of a backstabber. She's thrown Maduro under a bus. But the Americans secured the oil supply. The minute they did that, I said, this is a precursor to war with Iran. They were positioning themselves to ensure that they could still have oil supplies when Iran turned off the taps, which is exactly what's happened. Anyway, that's pretty much the show for this Friday. I really hope things improve. I predict that things are only going to get worse. And as usual, the Brits and the French and the Germans, these idiots, skid marks, and, the dog rooter in NATO, they're all going to get dragged into this because they've got no independent will of their own. I think Russia and China will try to stay the hell out of it, but they will support Iran behind the scenes, obviously. And I think Iran on its own is going to keep pummeling Israel and the United States. Now, the problem with having Donald Trump in power is at what point will he pull out? If he will pull out, how far does this escalate? Bottom line, I don't know, and I don't think anyone who says they know really does. Ultimately, it's an extremely volatile situation which could go in many different directions, and my concern is that Israel is tempted to do a nuclear strike on Iran. I wouldn't put it past Netanyahu. As I said, the man's a psychopath. He is an absolute homicidal lunatic, and it would not surprise me at all if that's what he did, and I hope that doesn't happen. Anyway, fingers crossed that we'll all still be here to talk maybe next Friday or the Friday after. So Bintang Bernie, wishing you all the best, and mate, good time to buy an electric car.
And if you don't like it, then leave. Or use your right to protest on the streets.